Welcome back and thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective. I am Kenneth Shark Kinney, your host and Chief Shark Officer. If you've ever worked with or for a brand, especially on the agency or consulting side, servicing another brand, then you know that what they are at their core is incredibly important as to how they will service their clients and customers. But a lot of them do not stay consistent to their core, and it's often that they won't look in the mirror to see what that core is. Many just don't recognize that they need to change, or they create an inconsistency that makes things as simple as creating content incredibly difficult. But when you peel back the layers, what is that brand in the raw? Jacqueline Lieberman is the founder of marketing consultancy BrandCrudo. She's a certified brand strategist and a podcast host. And on this episode, we'll discuss brand storytelling, the raw truth of a brand, and some raw foods, intense collaboration, aligning content strategy, DNA, elevating the story with a Jolly Green Giant, vegetarians, a garden of olives, and a lot more. So let's tune into a DNA storyteller with a storyteller whose DNA is obviously shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, sure, Kenneth. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
That's easy in that I'm an agency veteran. So I've worked at ad agencies my entire career, with the exception of a little stint at Priceline.com I did for 5 years there. And that was actually the start of me thinking about consumer insights. Was working at Priceline, believe it or not, because I started listening to customer service phone calls to answer the question of like, why is our airline ticket refund rate going through the roof? So I started listening to customer service phone calls, and it was very obvious, what we had to do and the adjustments we had to make on the website. And I started to really get excited about feeling like, wow, if we actually really listen to these people firsthand, we could really affect the business in huge ways. And that was kind of my first foray into delving into consumer insights. And I took that into an agency called Story Worldwide, where we focused on brand storytelling. And there I was charged with, look, we are focused on brand storytelling. Every agency has a strategic planning practice. How can we storyize this thing? And that's where I really just spent, a good part of a decade really, creating a narrative based approach to planning and understanding the art and science behind, what consumers are thinking, and marrying that with the DNA of a brand and creating a brand story that can go out in marketing in a way that's engaging.
So you started BrandCrudo. Where does the name come from?
So crudo is Italian for raw, also Spanish for raw. And I wanted to talk about a raw truth of a brand. And the reason why that I think that's important is because I think with brand storytelling and even just with marketing in general, there's just a lot of BS out there.
Really?
And it's
Yeah,
market
never noticed.
it's exactly. And it's marketing for marketing's sake, and there's a lot of noise. And I always felt that if you always started with the raw truth, the DNA of a brand, of like the fundamental characteristics of what a brand is about, you can't go wrong. It's when you start adding all of these ancillary layers on top of a brand, and you start to create this, marketing monster that has no semblance of where the brand actually came from. That's where brands start kind of going off the rails.
And so Brand Raw, you didn't like the name of that. Brand Crud just wouldn't sound right.
Exactly. Well, and I'm also kind of a foodie, so I had something to do with food. And so I just kind of, when I thought of brand crudo, I said, if this could represent the way brands can find and tell their raw truth, that's what I want my consultancy to be about.
When you talk about identifying the DNA of an agency's brand, how do you go about finding that? It's not easy for them to really be able to look in the mirror or even know what it is.
Yeah. I mean, you have to start internally. You have to start with the stakeholders. You need to, even if they're the stakeholders who they had nothing to do with, finding the business at all, and they're not founders, but I need to understand, why are they there? What is their role? What is the vision that they are trying to achieve with this particular business? Because and in doing that, I do that through stakeholder interviews, in-person workshops and work sessions. Uh, then understanding the landscape of like who are they competing against and what is their white space. And all of that is, you're starting from the inside in order for you to then externally market to people, right? So it's like you have to start on the inside of like the people who are responsible for those messages. You need to get under the hood of like, what are they thinking? What do they care about? Where do they want to see this brand go? Um, and it's when we kind of emerge from the process, we emerge with an understanding of what the brand stands for. And that to me is what I call the raw truth. Is this is your fundamental belief. It's non-negotiable, doesn't change with a marketing objective or a business objective.
How often do you find that they truly accept that, though? Or maybe how often do you find that it's eye-opening to them that this is maybe not where they thought they were today compared to where they started? I'm curious just because for a lot of people, just the I don't know if it's ego or complexity or whatever you want to call it, even if you put the DNA or the solution, if you will, right in front of their face, they may not see it and recognize it.
Yes. And that happens all the time. And the way to combat that is through intense collaboration. So it would never be so gone are the days, and this was probably the case, 10, 15 years ago in agency life, where you would kind of go away and then you go to the client with a big reveal and it's like ta-da, and then they're sitting there kind of crossing their arms and they're like, I don't know, or this or that. That model is gone. And it's gone for a really good reason. So intense collaboration. So that's about saying, I go off, I do my thing, whether my thing is that competitive audit or it's stakeholder interviews. And then I come back in and I create these mini milestones along the way and say, okay, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm hearing. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? I get feedback and then I go away and I do more of my thing. So whatever that thing is that's needed. So whether it's another work session, whether it's start interviewing consumers, and then come back and say, okay, so this is what I'm hearing here. This is different from what you said here. Let's talk about that. Why is that? So I think it's bringing the clients along the journey with you. By the end of this process, they're nodding their heads because they're part of it. They're part of this evolution. So even though, I might be holding up a mirror to them and initially they might not like it if I kind of start kind of poking them in the eye a little bit and being like, well, I don't know, I'm calling BS on this. By the end of the journey, they'll be like, okay, so I see that there's strands of our DNA in this new place that you took us, but I like this new place where you took us because they still see themselves in it, but they also see where they can go next.
Where do you find when you're constructing this story for the brand that's the most impactful, at least to open their eyes? It's hard to get a lot of people that have been doing the same thing at an agency. If it's a mature agency, say 5 to 10 years or more, it's very hard for them to look themselves in the mirror there. It's very hard for them to open up to an external person like you and say, here, go interview our customers. It's
Mhm.
very often that they may not listen to the newest people who have the freshest pair of eyes. So, what's the best way for them to open the kimono, if you will, so that you can, it's a weird analogy, peek in and
Yeah.
take a look under the hood?
Well, I mean, the most tried and true way, and then this is kind of like where my journalistic roots of being at Story, really comes true, which is you got to talk to people, and it's the stakeholder interviews. And you have to talk to all of those people who you just described. So whether they're the descenders, they're the owners of the place, they're new on the scene. I kind of want to talk to all of them. I want to talk to the legacy people. I want to talk to people who just joined last month. And I want to talk to all the people in between. And I ask them the same series of questions, which is, kind of, I mean, obviously my discussion guides are all bespoke, but I mean, but they're generally speaking, it's about, why are you here? Where do you see this company going? What is your role in making this company achieve that thing? And So that right there, that process alone helps them trust me because I'm asking these questions in a way that's intimate because they're one-on-one interviews. Then I bring them all back together and they all get to see one another's feedback right there live. And so they get to see, like, oh, I'm not the only one who said this. Someone else thinks this. In fact, everybody kind of thinks this. Or they might see something and say, oh, that's interesting. I've never thought of that before. And that creates a dialogue, not just with me, but it creates a dialogue internally. So all of a sudden, this thing that they didn't really want to do because they were like, ugh, I don't know if we need this reset button. I don't know if we need to go through all of this and go through this self examination. All of a sudden, they realize that they end up having these conversations that they haven't had in a really long time. They needed to have them. And then they realize that some people, especially the new people on the scene, they have a fresh perspective and they're there and they were hired for a reason. So it just gets the juices flowing and the dialogue flowing, and all of that is in service of them, trusting me with this information and doing good with it. It's not, this is not about exploitation. It's about taking them on this journey of helping them evolve their brand positioning in wherever way that they need to evolve it to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does completely. And you just mentioned the usual suspects, if you will, are going to be very bespoke. And I've found it to be really impactful for people to consider talking to everybody that's not on the management team,
Hmm.
because I don't think half the time people know. They may believe that those people have bought into the, drunk the Kool-Aid or know what the message is, but most of the time they don't. And it's a lot of assumption. And then it applies the same way to a lot of
Yeah.
customers. They have a feeling that they know what you do. So a lot of agencies don't have that end consumer perspective or point of view. Has that come up in your journey with these people searching for their DNA?
Yeah. I mean, it comes up in the sense of, they, for example, they want to do research, or they might say, we have a sample of people that we want to survey. And I say, great. I'm all into research, whether it's quant or qual. But I always want to look at the questions that are being asked, because a lot of times the way that they go about research, and agencies are at fault for this as well, which is they go about it through the feature functions of the product or service that is trying to be sold. And while all of that is great to know, we want to know, what did they buy, when did they buy, how often, all of this stuff. But that's not going to tell me. I want to know, how does this brand make this person feel? So if it's a retail store, the second that they open up the door to that shop, what are they feeling? I want to know, why are they standing in there? What is it about this store that's making them come here versus someplace else? And a lot of times those types of questions are overlooked because when we think research, we think very kind of scientific methodology questions, which again are necessary. But the way that I always go about it and kind of help agencies and brands is getting really under the hood of, like, you need to find out, how are people feeling in their gut about your brand.
Yeah. So you've helped identify this story, this narrative for the agency to look at their DNA and figure out who they are. Once you've helped identify that, how do you help enable that? I mean, ultimately it's left up to them, but once you've figured out that they need to make a shift of some sort, how do you typically take what you found and discovered and put that in a package that they can consume and implement?
Yeah. So that's exactly what I do, which is, once I do my discovery piece and I
You
go through the
package it up in a nice big binder and send it, never to send talk to them ever again. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, and I say, later, thanks, checks in the mail. No, it's like, so I identify, that raw truth by looking at that, here's what you used to do, here's what you're doing now, here's where you want to go. And when I get to that point, I give them this raw truth in a way that's a manifesto, it's a phrase, But really, what it ends up that I end up giving brands is a master creative brief, first and foremost. And I call it a master creative brief because it's the one pager that's so succinct that any human being in the agency, outside the agency, or the brand can pick it up and go and act on it. They don't even need me to take them through it. They can read it and they can act on it. So, at the very, very least, I leave clients with, of course, the journey of how we got to the truth. Here's your master creative brief that should inform all communications, at least, to just kind of be that 30,000-foot North Star. So, whenever you start to feel like you're going off the rails, you refer to this as the reset. And then, but more specifically, after that, content strategies. I
Amen.
do
I was just about to ask that. Yeah.
content strategies have to be rooted in, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking like a channel strategy, social, this or that, everything is digital, everything's social. It doesn't matter. It's channel agnostic. What has to happen is when your raw truth is up there as your part of your content strategy, and that's the anchor, then you start to define what are the different content pillars and lanes that you have the authority to talk about. So if your raw truth is this, then you have the authority to talk about X, Y, Z. And anything outside of that, so if you're looking at, say, a campaign or a partnership or a marketing effort, if it's falling outside of that content strategy and that raw truth framework, you need to have a really good reason as to why you're going outside of it, because that's kind of the checkpoint to look at it to keep you honest as a brand and say, okay, well, if we're going to go and have a partnership that has nothing to do with our brand DNA, and has nothing to do with our marketing objectives, then we have to have a really good reason as to why this partnership is important to us.
Yeah, I could not agree more because I mean, creating content's actually pretty easy if you've got a really well laid out strategy that goes back to the core of what you are, who you serve, and how you serve them. The rest of it's, to me, I've found to be fairly easy. It's cutting through the clutter to get there, because if you don't know who you are, well, your customer or their end customer never
Yes.
will.
Yes.
It's so impactful. And I mention all the time that the confused buyer always says no.
Yeah.
So, whether it's through metrics or some other form, describe the successes you've seen when somebody has done this, I almost say to themselves, but looked at themselves in the mirror and gotten back to their raw truth.
Yes. I mean, so at the highest level, the success is that the product or service or brand is no longer in the commodity space, and they have now elevated themselves beyond a price war, beyond being just a commodity that could be replaced with anybody in their category. So that's a factor of good branding, not just marketing. So it's good branding because you kind of can't separate the brand from the business. And so the success is when people say that, they're going in and they're buying a particular product, and they're buying it, yes, for all of those functional reasons. So if it's, Subway sandwiches, for example, it's like they can go to, their local deli if they want to or whatever, but Subway is kind of ubiquitous. It's on a lot of street corners everywhere. It's right there. When people open up the door to go to a Subway, they're immediately feeling better about their lunch choice because you know what? They could have gone to Taco Bell and they didn't. So they immediately feel better. Even if they walk in and they get that meatball sub, they just feel better because Subway represents eat fresh, right? Because that's their DNA. That's what they tell us in marketing. So success is when people, yes, they're buying your product or service, but they're believing in your brand and what you represent. Yeti is another really good example. Yeti makes cups, coolers. Yes, they figured out, finally, somebody figured out how to make a cooler that doesn't leak. Thank you. I don't know why it was so hard for so many years, but they figured it out. But people are paying $300 for this cooler because they know it works. But at the same point, that brand represents adventure. They tell stories about adventure. whether or not you've ever find yourself fly fishing, you don't care. You'll still watch a video because you're already bought into the brand. So, so that's how I measure success is like, that box that we create in our own minds that we do with marketing, which is so when we think Yeti, we think adventure, we think Volvo, we think safety. Um,
Well, I think I was thinking though, how do they declare success? The agencies you serve, how do they declare success out of this? At least what metrics have you heard or seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, when I work with ad agencies, the way that I know I'm doing my job is when they get more work, and so I help them lay the foundation of all of this branding work, and by doing that, the agency has an elevated seat at the table because they're part of these DNA discussions as opposed to, can I have a social post about this? So they already have an elevated seat at the table. When that work goes amazingly well, which it always does, then it's like, well, there's no question why we can't give you this campaign and that campaign. And so that's my measure of success is when I see the agencies I work for getting more business.
How do you see the agency landscape today? Because obviously there is a need for your service. Things didn't go awry just overnight. They've happened
Mhm.
over an amount of time, but I'm curious how you see the landscape today with agencies because there's just so many of them sprouting
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, similar to how, I have my consulting practice that is strictly rooted in strategic planning. I do not do creative. I don't write. I don't want to make a mini agency. I do brand DNA work, branding work, strategic planning. And that's what I do: content strategies, briefs, making sure that the creative team gets really excited about what their next step is. That is my job. Now, the agencies, the huge agencies, they typically are having problems because they don't have experts in their craft. They have, it's like jack of all trades, master of none. And that's why these little agencies have popped up and have been successful because they're focusing on a niche. So whether that niche is technology or B2B or it's CPG or it's storytelling and video or whatever that is, they're an expert in their craft and they're an expert for a reason. And you can't think that you're going to get the same exact service from a giant conglomerate. Now, even though they might have all the global reach that anybody can, and they'll have dollar efficiencies and all of that stuff, but there's a cost to that. There's a cost to that. And the cost is not fees. The cost is that your message is going to get watered down somehow because you're not going to have the expert people thinking about your business. You're going to have you're going to have marginal level people thinking about it. And you know what? You're not the only brand that they're thinking about. They have 12 other brands that they're thinking about. So
Amen to that.
how could you possibly have the best service, the best outcome, the best brain space when you're dealing with people who are commodities in and of themselves?
One of the clients you were brought in with, I understand, from our friend Michael. Tell me about the story. You were brought in to look at our good friend, the big green one,
Oh, the Green Giant?
the Jolly Green Giant.
Yeah. So that one.
How do you take a brand like Jolly Green Giant or Green Giant and take an out of date brand identity and change that up?
Yeah, that was a fun story in that the initial problem was they were going to actually kill off the giant General Mills at one point in time to basically just have it be a logo on a package and that's it. No character, no, branding, no anything. Kind of similar to how they did with Betty Crocker, who used to be an actual person back in the day. Now it's just a logo. So they were going to kind of do the same thing because they're like, Green Giant's not relevant anymore to younger people. So we kind of raised our hands, and this is when I was at Story, and it was, we give us a chance to save them. If we don't save them, you don't have to pay us, but like give us a chance to kind of convince you. So we conducted a workshop, And just like in every workshop, there's always like, so you have all of these people from different walks of the company, and I always ask for not just marketing people. I want somebody from R&D,
Yes.
customer service,
Yeah.
sales, all of that. So I have that. Uh, all of a sudden, a VP who was quiet all day long happens to just pipe up later, and he starts to tell a story about how um, there's seeds in Minnesota that they have these relationships with Mexican farmers. So a lot of times you'll see on packages that it's like, from Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. And then you might say on the surface, like, well, why is Green Giant like, exporting from Mexico? But it's not about that. It's they have generational ties to these farms and farmers in Mexico. They take the same seeds in Minnesota and they transplant them and give them to the farmers in Mexico to make sure that it's the same quality, it's the same through line, the same DNA that's going through, that's being transferred to their crops in Mexico. And I said, so he pipes up with that out of nowhere when I started a probe on trust and quality. Like, well, what do you mean by that? And everybody says that. And he tells me that story. And I said, no one knows this. Does anyone know this? Everyone just thinks that you're like exporting from Mexico. And and he's like, yeah, no, we don't talk about that. I'm like, okay, well, I feel like this is something we're kind of on to something here. And it wasn't just about like, let's talk about Mexico, but it was more about saying the care and control that they have from this huge company, is really about that kind of obsessive control over your product. So the narrative of where that ended up going, right? So from that nugget in a workshop was Green Giant is no longer about, 3 bags of peas for $10. It's now about the natural guardian of growing. So the Green Giant represents this natural guardian of crops, guardian of growing great healthy families, growing great kids, and healthy food. And so all of a sudden that elevates the story from talking about like competing with Bird's Eye in the
Right.
freezer space to now it's like, now you have not just a character that you made up, you have a representation of this control and care of trust and quality in what you're delivering to people. That's a story that you want to tell to people, not just 3 for $10.
Right. Well, it's good to know that in this cancel culture era, it had nothing to do with being offensive to Kermit the Frog or any other green Shrek or
No,
any other green characters that may
we,
have
we
gotten offended.
we did advise them to maybe like put a little bit more clothes on him than just the
Yeah.
loincloth. That was just a little
Well,
advice.
he'll be gender neutral at some point. So that's ultimately what'll happen. So, Jacqueline, what
Exactly.
do you do for fun other than drink out of a Yeti? And
Yeah. Well, kind of similar to, my themes of BrandCrudo and my podcast Uncooked. I like to cook. So I do, and I am the anti-vegetarian, and that not that I don't love vegetarians, I just will never be one. I like to grill meat, smoke meat, age meat, roast it. I mean, you name it, pull it. And so experimenting with my smoker in the spring and summer is probably one of my favorite things to do.
yeah, I actually grill vegetarians. I've bacon wrapped anybody that's a vegetarian, and so what
Exactly.
you're on a shark's perspective, and I got to ask, if you have one, but what is your favorite kind of shark and why?
It's funny, and you probably get this answer all the time, but it's the great white, and it's because I have childhood memories of being fascinated yet terrified at exactly the same time, remembering like the Jacques Cousteau shows and
Oh
videos
yeah.
and and seeing him in a cage and all of that. And I remember wanting to be an oceanographer at one point when I was like around 6. And then I saw the movie Jaws and I was like, maybe I don't want to do that if I actually have to get in a cage with them. But then even watching Jaws as a kid, I just was so fascinated by the intense power and the fear of the music. So even listening to your podcast and how you're starting with like the music, that immediately gives me this visceral reaction of like, I'm really scared right now.
Well, and Cousteau was one of he was the OG marine
Yeah.
biologist who did everything he could to dispel a lot of the bad myths and,
Yes,
show that they were apex predators, but not the monsters that have been portrayed,
I
even
know.
though, and Jaws is one of the worst and best movies from an emotional standpoint. If you want to talk about how it makes people feel, it taps into that visceral emotion that,
Yes.
unlike 99.9% of the movies ever in the world, it's just something that hits you carnally, but
Yeah,
it's still so ridiculous. Jacqueline, it's a special time of the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
I think so. We'll see.
All right. Number 1. So we were talking about a mutual friend of ours who wrote a book about hype. So I'm going to ask you this question. And you also alluded a little bit to the why part of it. So Simon Sinek or Gary Vaynerchuk?
Hmm.
Are you a why kind of gal or a hype kind of gal?
I'm gonna have to go with Simon. But I have heart for Gary V. I like his style, like his no BS,
It's raw. Yeah.
I like it, but I'm gonna have to go with
Yeah.
Simon.
All right. So we got a few food questions next. So number 2, really important question for a raw person: celery or carrots?
Mm. I'm gonna have to do celery because it
Okay.
reminds
Good
me of a
choice.
Bloody Mary. So
There you go. All right. Number 3, very important Italian question since you based it off Crudo. Carrabba's or Olive Garden, 2 of the finest Italian restaurants in the world.
Mm. Do I have to pick one?
Well, you did bring up Taco Bell and Subway, so if you can bring Taco Bell and Subway up, I'll bring up
Uh,
Carrabba's and Olive Garden.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I know they're both chains, and I'm gonna have to go with Carrabba's only because, yeah, I don't know.
Okay. The answer is actually Olive Garden because they have breadsticks and the rest of the food. Yeah, so. All right, number 4,
Yeah.
Doritos or Cheetos,
Oh, definitely Doritos.
because you're going to get orange stuff on your fingers either way.
Either way, but man, who doesn't love a really good Dorito?
Exactly. All right, number 5, and the most important question you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread.
Biscuits, 100%. Flaky buttermilk biscuits that I have tried my hand in. So, being a smoking meat person, I try to go all Southern,
Right.
and I've tried some biscuits, and I think I'm getting there. I haven't mastered it, but I'm getting there. They're flaky and good versus the hockey
Yeah.
pucks that I tried initially. So definitely biscuits.
Well, Jacqueline, where do people find out more about you, get in touch with you on social channels, listen to the podcast and more?
Yeah. I mean, the best place to get all of that is on my website, which is brandcrudo.com, all one word, brandcrudo.com. And that's where you have all my social channels, and you can link to my podcast, Uncooked. And if I could say one thing about Uncooked, which is
Yeah.
I named it that because I wanted it to be about raw insights, something that's not polished, it's not already curated. It's about, really, looking at it from a different angle that's not pristine. And I kind of hope the audience agrees when they listen to it.
Excellent. Jacqueline, thank you so much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
So there was my conversation with Jacqueline Lieberman, the founder of marketing consultancy BrandCrudo. She's a certified brand strategist and a podcast host. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with her. First, I heard her make a point about intense collaboration. I really wanted to lean into this from past experience. And if you're working with an agency or consultant, then lean in. Get closer to your agency, and if not closer to you, then at least closer to other agencies. The point is that your end customers deserve that better efficiency, and that once-a-week phone call or semi-regular email with several agencies doesn't always work very well, not for the benefit of your schedule, but for the benefit of your customer. And the closer you pull them in, then the closer you'll get to figuring out if they're really the right partner or long-term player. A lot of people see how they're managing vendors and think that works well, but most of the time it's uncomfortably distant or inefficient at best. Second, you've got to align your content strategy with your raw truth. This is so very, very true. She reminds us not to fall too far outside of that framework to keep honest to who we are. She said, if you don't know who you are, then your customers or their end customers never will. Great point. Third, one of the good things with niching an agency with a task is that when they focus on that smaller task, they'll often do well. But when it keeps expanding, then it becomes a big tangled mess for most, with a lot of vendors creating a lot of new problems. So if you're managing this, it's up to you to stitch that together so that your end customer, your message, doesn't get watered down. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time, and I'm so thankful for everyone who listens. And by the way, sharks aren't vegetarians, at least this one isn't, but I could go for some celery right now, maybe a carrot. Join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.